Good afternoon and welcome to today's event. I'm Andrea Williams, Associate Professor of English and also Director of the Women's Place. It is my pleasure today to be able to be in conversation with Dr. Valerie Lee about her new book, Sister Locking Discourse, Race, Gender, and the 21st Century Academy. In this telling collection of essays, Dr. Lee, now retired from Ohio State, shares in her own experience and insights about academic labor, diversity, and leadership in higher education. We're all eager to hear more from her, but first, a few notes. Today's presentation is being live captioned. The event will be recorded and made available on the Women's Place website within a week. In this webinar format, all guests are muted with their cameras and the chat function disabled, but we encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A function near the center of your screen. We'll leave time to ask questions with Dr. Lee to answer any of those after our moderated exchange. For many of the more than 250 people who registered for today's talk, Dr. Valerie Lee is both a familiar face and an institution in herself. Over a career that spanned more than 40 years, she has been an innovative voice in the study and teaching of African-American literature and folklore, as well as a recognized university leader. Lee's book, Granny Midwives and Black Women Writers, Double Dutched Readings in 1996, wove together accounts of historical midwives and their fictional literary counterparts as central to Black reproductive health practices, community building, and passing down family legacies. Inspired by observing the childhood game of jumping rope double dutch, Lee introduces a two-stranded reading method that allows her to bring together folk experience and literary history, challenging academic binaries that might separate lived and literary experiences. Lee is also the editor of the Prentice Hall Anthology of African-American Women's Literature in 2006. This comprehensive volume leveraged the growth of Black women's authorship of the 1980s and 1990s by demonstrating that Black women's literature was complex, capacious, and appealing enough to deserve sustained attention. This anthology indicates how happily work by Black women writers has been reevaluated since the time that Lee began her career. For then, it was the case that in early English departments, they were often less interested in and sometimes downright dismissive towards the study of the work of Black women and other writers of color. As importantly, Valerie Lee has made a mark at Ohio State, leading as the chair of 3 different departments: Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, English, and African American and African Studies. When she took the helm of the English department, she began as the first Black woman chair in the department's long history. Near the conclusion of her career, she was the university's vice provost for diversity and inclusion, as well as vice president for outreach and engagement. Over the last 2 decades, scholars of color have published a spate of personal accounts that recount their disappointing, triumphant, and sometimes outright angering experiences as Black and brown thinkers moving through and against a world unaccustomed to recognizing their brilliance, dignity, creativity, and most of all, their humanity. The searing volumes, such as Presumed Incompetent, is perhaps the most notable of these. In case some of you are unfamiliar with that book, I encourage you to have a look. But in Sister Locking Discourse, Lee shares both how she encountered similar microaggressions, but as often, how she gained the respect, support, and admiration of colleagues who looked to her to be decisive, forthright, and a visionary leader in higher education. Lee's ascent attests to the value of and need for women of colors and others from a range of backgrounds to gain access, mentorship, and opportunities for leadership. Yet diversifying leadership demands that we recognize promise and leadership competencies that do not always align with white male hegemonic power. For Lee's part, she credits the women in her family about which she writes in this book, especially her grandmother, as modeling the self-direction that allowed her, in her own words, to do what was needed to get the job done. Lee recognized in her community those who often led without the benefit of formal titles. Reciprocally, her family encouraged in her what they called smarts, and intelligence and common sense that would allow for her to lead success as an educator, scholar, and administrator. There is still much work to be done in higher education to make sure that it is more demographically representative, and whether we're talking about areas of student enrollment to faculty and staff retention to senior college and university leadership. Nationally, Black women still only account for less than 3% of tenure track faculty. More immediately, Ohio State had only 54 Black women tenure track faculty in 2020. And in fact, that was one fewer than the 55 present a decade earlier in 2010. While numbers among Latinx and Asian American women faculty saw a slight increase during this decade, those numbers are still minuscule among the thousands of employees here. The stories of race, gender, and the 21st Century Academy are not, in Toni Morrison's words, a story to pass on, or perhaps they are. In fact, Lee shows us the outcomes of women of color and underrepresented leaders is worth recording, but hopefully not worth repeating. That is not worth occurring over and over again in the future. To the extent that Ohio State and other higher education institutions have taken a self-reflective move towards accountability and inclusive leadership development, we all owe a professional debt to today's speaker, Dr. Valerie Lee. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for being here with us today.
Thank you.
So it has been such a pleasure to get to know both more about your professional path and about your personal path by getting to read this book. And I know that you love literature. You made your primary mark as a literary critic, but in this volume, you decided to branch out a bit. In fact, only one of the chapters focuses on literature, while much of the book is venturing into life writing. How did you decide to branch out a bit more into other styles of writing beyond literary analysis in this book?
Okay, branching out. As far as branching out, Black women scholars and creative artists have always branched out or played with the question of genre. For instance, you take Ntozake Shange. When she wrote her play for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough, she did not call it a play. She called it a choreo poem, right? Or when Octavia Butler wrote Kendrick, she did not say that it was science fiction. She said it was a grim fantasy. Or when Audre Lorde wrote her autobiography, Audre Lorde did not say that, oh, I have written an autobiography. She called it an automythography. Or when Patricia Williams, the law professor, wrote The Alchemy of Race and Rights, what was that? Was it creative nonfiction or was it law? My point is that you're using the word branching out. And when I hear branching out, I think of an act of freedom by those who are always searching for freedom. Now, you've quoted Toni Morrison, and so of course I'm going to quote Toni Morrison too. And it's on this notion of an act of freedom and the branching out. Morrison, in her novel Sula, when she's talking about Sula and her girlfriend Nell, there's a line, and I'm paraphrasing this, but it says something like, because each had discovered years before that they were neither white nor male, and all freedom and triumph was forbidden to them, they set about creating something else to be. So sometimes you want to do things that are not easily contained in generic structures. I'm thinking that perhaps the creation of genre, or this branching out that you're asking about, is somehow related to the creation of personhood, that sometimes you have to create your own genres and your own methodologies, especially fields such as women's gender and sexuality studies and African American and African studies, these interdisciplinary fields that focus on intersecting and unlocking ways of thinking and being, this branching out. The other word I heard in your question was life writing. As far as life writing, I don't think it's unusual for feminist scholars to theorize experience. They talk about experience as being both personal and social, and how we have to learn to historicize experience, that we not only have experiences, but we are constituted through those experiences. I think Joan Scott said that. But this idea of life writing, during the first week of January, I was listening in on a Zoom to a panel at the Modern Language Association. And the title of the panel was Diverse Leadership in the Academy. And then they had all of these newly minted African-American women deans and newly minted chairs and deans from the LGBTQ community. And I noticed that instead of reading a paper, they all shared their life stories, this idea of life writing. And so many of the African-American women critics that I respect have indeed written their life stories. Trudia Harris and Deborah McDowell, Ann Ducille, Patricia Williams, they all have shared their stories. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, once I entered administration, I believe that administration invited me to do more life writing, because administration disrupts and it changes the direction of scholarly pursuits. My previous scholarship that focused more directly on literary analysis, I needed long periods of concentrated time in order to do that kind of writing. But once I became an administrator and I'm working 8 to 5, 12 months a year, it was a whole different story. Originally, I was planning to write a book that I was going to call Neo-Slave Narratives, Feminist Neo-Slave Narratives. And I was running around the country giving all of these talks on feminist neo-slave narratives, because I noticed long before Toni Morrison wrote Beloved, and I think Beloved came out in 1987, but long before that, I had noticed that all of these African-American women were writing these neo-slave narratives. But then when I became the vice provost of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, I did not have time to actually go back to that particular project, because first of all, other books started coming out on that topic since I didn't have time, and you have to intervene in the conversation and all of that, and you have to have something new to say. But by the time I was the vice provost of diversity and inclusion, I had to take a deep dive into a whole new area, because people don't understand that diversity has its own scholarship, it has its own conferences and everything. And that doing diversity is not everybody's pickup game, So I had to focus on that. In fact, one of the early leadership conferences that I was at, OSU, there was a slogan that we learned, and I have kept that with me. I have it right here. Look, can you see it? Be
Yes.
here now. So that's what I had to do in terms of when I became an administrator. I had to focus on that. So you're right. There is only one chapter that is a direct shout out to my literary training, although I have allusions to poems and novels throughout. And the other thing that changed, that when you're asking about branching out and life writing, my imagined audience changed. When I first started writing, of course, I was thinking about the audience of literary studies. That's when I was going to do this neo-feminist slave narrative. And then when I became a senior administrator, I imagined that my audience would be those who were interested in higher education's leadership roles. But by the time I finished my narrative, I was retired. So then my imagined audience became my own grandchildren. And I asked myself, when my grandchildren get older, what book of mine would I want them to take off the shelf and read? And I imagine that I would want them right before they enter college to take off the shelf Sister Locken Discourse. So I really, in the end, wrote it for them, but I hope that I have written it in such a way that others can listen in.
I like your attention to the shifting audience, and especially the kind of tactile of taking the book off the shelf, because when we do that, one of the first things we notice is the great cover. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the title and the cover. I know we've talked in our prior conversations, and also to give a hint to those who haven't started reading yet, you explored this a bit more in your introduction. So share a little bit more about why the cover and the title are so meaningful for you.
Okay, at first I should say that when I have a son who asked me, what's the title of your next book? And he was writing it down. And I told him Sister Locken Discourse. And I looked over his shoulder and I saw that he had written the word discourse as D-I-S-C-O-A-R-S-E instead of D-I-S-C-O-U-R-S-E. And I was just about to tell him that he had misspelled that word. And I placed myself in check because he has long locks and he was deliberately punning. And I love that. So I said, I'm going to call it Sister Locken Discourse, and I'm going to spell discourse that way. And then I started worrying about, I said, oh, but my colleagues in English will think I just misspelled this word. So I wanted to put the course part in parentheses, you know how people do that. But my publisher said, no, you don't have to do that. Just write discourse that way. But the best way I can really tell you what I had in mind is if I could just read the first two paragraphs of the book.
That'd be great.
Okay. All right. It starts off with a quotation from the woman who used to twist my hair. And I say used to because once the pandemic started, I had to learn to do it myself, which I did. Ms. Valerie, what do you want to do with your new growth? Jeannie, my hairdresser. What to do with new growth is a choice that over the years, many Black women have faced. For it is the hair's new growth that exposes texture untouched by chemicals, hot combs, flat irons, dyes, or anything meant to relax the hair. This is a book about new growth. Although its foundational metaphors are taken from Black women's hair politics, it is fundamentally a book about how a young Black woman finishing her doctorate in the late 1970s and retiring 40 some years later as a vice provost and vice president at one of the nation's largest universities, learned to navigate an academy that was not quite ready for Brown and Black women. Because I did not look like most of my colleagues at every stage of my career, I literally confronted the issue of what to do with my hair in tandem with how to manage new growth opportunities presented by professional advancements. Like my hair's own new growth, the experiences that I share are not always in a linear sequence, but coil in my memories in different ways. Some of these memories are downright nappy. Others reflect strengthening processes that I probably needed, as I am what higher education now calls a first generation underrepresented student. For Black professional women, hair has been a chronological, cultural, and climate thermometer. Chronologically, some of this book's early essays were written when natural hair was not considered professional. When I was graduating from high school, afros were beginning to come in style, a detail I remember because my predominantly white high school had one hair rule. If one's hair flowed downward, it could be as long as one wanted it to be, but any hair spiraling upward had to be within so many inches from the scalp. Of course, the only hairstyles that stood stalwartly upward were the Black students' afros. During my late teens and early 20s, I had gone through the afro stage in college, but by grad school, I was back to perms. As of that time, I had not read Gwendolyn Brooks's poem, "To those of my sisters who kept their naturals, never to look a hot comb in the teeth." By mid-career, and after having taught many Black women authors who wrote proudly about hair, I became uncomfortable teaching what I was not living. Hair became a cultural thermometer. While teaching Toni Morrison Sula, how could I empathize with Nell's evolving disinterest in hot combs and smooth hair if I was unwilling to listen to the Sula sisterhood in my own life, who too were championing their natural selves? Or how many times could I teach Morrison's Song of Solomon and hear Hagar's crying awareness that her lover, Milkman, did not love her soft, damp wool hair, without acknowledging my own unease with my permed hair? And how long could I be critical of the characters in Morrison's Tar Baby, who saw twisted locked hair as low class, if I had been unwilling to let my own hair challenge professional status norms? Among their many themes, the one theme that every Black woman author I taught seemed to be addressing was beauty aesthetics. From the I voice in Itazaki Shange's Nappy Edges to Celie's voice in Alice Walker's The Color Purple, to the two-headed woman's voice in Lucille Clifton's poem, Homage to My Hair, who declares that her nappy hair is as tasty on your tongue as good greens, Black man.
I love that, especially the ways that you're thinking about hair as both ordinary and extraordinary for women of color, especially Black women in the academy and other professions where their natural hair is often considered inappropriate. As recently as last year in 2021, the city of Columbus adopted the Crown Act as a municipal ordinance to prevent discrimination on the basis of hair. And I always think the very fact that you have to have a policy or a law to allow you to wear your hair in its natural state, I think speaks so much to the ways that our bodies are not always welcome in these kind of professional and educational spaces. But one of the things that you talk about throughout the book is how often you look to those challenges in the face and you really took on those expectations and challenged them about how higher education administrators or professors should look, especially as you were traveling around, for example. And again, that was really great to learn more about how travel had influenced some of your kind of impressions. So talk a little bit more about how you saw travel, especially internationally, impacting the way that you thought about identity politics.
Yes, I have indeed done a lot of traveling. In fact, the first plane ride I ever took was from New York to Paris. That means that I saw, when I landed in Europe, I saw palm trees in Italy long before I ever saw them in Florida or California. And I saw Switzerland's famous mountain Zermatt long before I saw the Smoky Mountains. And I was an education abroad student, so I feel very strongly about education abroad. And at first, when I was young, when I first traveled abroad, I was 19 years old. And I traveled as any teenager would. I was with this other group of Americans, and I got a little tired that summer going to every last cathedral and castle in Europe. And when I was at the top of Mont Blanc, I did what any 19-year-old would do. I wrote my then boyfriend's name in the ice. I'm glad that has probably melted. But the point is that as I traveled more and more, I began to see myself as traveling more as a daughter of a diaspora. And I had a number of different experiences that were growth experiences for me. And I'll share a story. I'll try to share some stories because my book does have a lot of stories. I was on my way to Venice, Italy, and I got separated from the group of Americans that I was with, and I was the only African American in the group anyway. And so I ended up on this boat with all of these Eastern Europeans, and everything was fine. They knew I had missed my group because they had seen me with the group, but they were really curious about me. They didn't quite know what I was, and I knew they were trying to ask me some questions. It was almost like a game of charade, and they kept pointing to me. And I knew they were trying to ask me something about my parents, and they were holding up these pens and everything. And I finally figured out that they were trying to ask me if both my mother and my father were Black. So I said yes, that was fine. And then they kept pushing it. And I finally figured out that the other question they wanted to ask me was if I was Black all over. Now, at this point, I said I should be real sassy about this. I said, no, I'm polka dot in some places, but I had read enough stories about people in rough waters who are different. And when the other people are really afraid or anything, what do? They throw over the person who's different. Jonah and the whale, they throw Jonah over and everything. He gets eaten by a large fish. So I held my peace and simply said, yes, I am Black all over. But then I started to look at myself and realize that, yes, other people were seeing me differently. And maybe in the Q&A, I can tell some more stories in terms of all of that. But I began to look at myself as I got older, as this daughter of the diaspora traveling around. And I've been to Ghana, and I've seen Elmina Castle. It's such a white, pristine place on the outside, but you smell the blood, and you see the blood and all the stench that's on the walls. And you visit within that castle, the place where the Dutch Reformed Church, where they were singing their hymns and everything. And you realize that underneath is where they kept the Black women and the young girls and everything. As I did more traveling, I know that I probably irritated tour guides because I was always asking these questions about identity and nationhood and accountability. when I was VP of ODI, I went with the first group of students that we went to Bahia in Brazil. And I'm told that there are more people of African descent in Brazil than in other places outside of the continent of Africa. And even though I was interested in ecotourism and coastal landscapes and everything, what I was most interested in, let me see the slave auctions. And that's how I have been as I've traveled the world. When I was in Brussels, they have this little statue all over the place of this little boy who supposedly saved the city from a citywide fire because he urinated on the fire. And the only thing I could think of was the way King Leopold urinated all over the Congo, so to speak, as if it were his private playground. So I couldn't shake the way that slavery has affected the whole world. Or when I went to places like the Bahamas, and of course, I would be lying if I said I didn't go to Paradise Island and the Atlantis, beautiful places. But what I was most interested in were the slave museums like Pompeii Museum, or take me to Clifton Pier where the slaves first landed. So I thought through a lot of identity politics through all of that travel. And it was an educational experience too. When I was in South Africa, the last time I was there, it was when Mandela died. And I remember being quite angry that I hadn't learned in my American history classes that Mandela, even though we called him Mandela, the people that he lived among, the people who really loved him, they had another whole name for him. It was Madiba. And I said, well, how come I hadn't heard of that? And I had always called him Mandela. I taught for 10 summers South African students in this country. This is before apartheid was dismantled. And I would stand in front of these classes every summer, and it was like 120 students in these classes. And here I was standing before these African students with my hyphenated existence. And I was feeling rather embarrassed because one of the things that I noticed is that the students at that time were sitting in class according to their skin color. So the coloreds were here, and then the Indians and the Blacks. But what really bothered me as the professor calling the roll, I could easily say the names of all of the coloreds because their names were British and Dutch names, and I knew the names of the Indian students because I was familiar with those students and this country. But I would stand in front of the Black Africans, and they had these consonant clusters so unfamiliar to my tongue, MZ, or words beginning with GC or NT. And so I had a lot to learn from them. And I had a lot to learn from the South Africans in general in terms of inclusivity, because you know how many languages South Africa has declared their national language? All 11 languages. I mean, that is really diversity and inclusion. So yes, traveling has been really good. It has taught me humility. It has taught me inclusivity. You get to decenter yourself and recenter yourself. And with all my travels, of course, I brought back a lot of mementos from my office. And so when you enter my office for the different roles that I have, I had all of these figurines from other countries. And I think that you have a picture of my office that you could probably show on the screen, because I just want to point out some things.
Yes.
With the office. When you see the picture of the office, yes. And it sort of reflected my world view, since we're talking about travels, Black offices matter. Oh yes, that's really good. And you notice on the picture, I have, well, the long oblong thing. One of my the staff persons in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion who belongs to an indigenous community gave me that. It's a rainmaker. And then I have such things as Haitian and Jamaican sculpture, and the copper figurine is actually called, where you see the 5 women of color holding hands. That's called Feminist 5. And I actually found that in a shop right here in Columbus. And I have all of these Varnett Honeywood pictures, Aaron Douglas pictures. I have something that was made from pop cans by women with disabilities, and posters from the Harlem Renaissance. What was interesting is one day someone walking in my office asked me, how do I think that white students feel when they come to have a conference with me? And I thought that was a really peculiar question, because no one asked Black students how the offices of white faculty make them feel. You know, whiteness is such an unmarked racial category that however white faculty decorate their offices is considered the norm. But it kind of threw me off when this person asked me, how do white students feel when they enter my particular office? But I love that office. That's in Hale Hall.
You know, as you think here, and again, the title Black Offices Matter was from some of the captioning within your book for this image. And it made me think about how often we talk about bringing different voices to the table. But I think what this points out too is that sometimes that table, sometimes that office, sometimes that very space itself needs to be transformed into a welcoming and more representative space. And so what I really appreciate about this is that you're looking for those kinds of ways that we can think about, what do we really mean about how leadership has to look, whether it's in you're thinking about your own appearance with your hair or how you're presenting your office. So around that topic of how leadership should look or even perform, I'd like to ask you, probably on behalf of many of the people who are here who might be interested in leadership roles as you took on in your own career, what are some of the ways that you think that people should prepare themselves for roles in higher administration? What are some of the kinds of characteristics that they need to possess? Or what do they really need to know about working in the academy that is maybe behind the scenes?
Okay, well, I think that what characteristics you need to know how to marshal resources. You need to know how to leverage talents and skills, and you need to want to bring out the best in others. If you are selfish, don't go into leadership roles. You know, if the only thing you care about is your own research or your own agenda, then don't go into higher administration, because you need to be of the mindset that I want to see others advance. And so that's one thing. Another thing to think about is that leadership is about relationships. So if you can't network, you won't be able to accomplish much. So that's something else that's very important. As far as if you're a person of color in leadership, and this is something I had to learn, some people actually call it professional malpractice. If you do not speak out when you really should speak out, that sometimes you have to be intrusive in places that are not inclusive. So that's something that I think people should bear in mind. But in general, you want to bring out the best in others. And I guess I'm one of those believers in servant leadership. That's why at the beginning of my book, I take a lot of time to thank all of my colleagues across the many academic departments that I have served and the academic support units. And I say that were it not for their collegiality and commitment, my whole career would not have been as joyous as it was. And I take the time to thank the many graduate students that I work with. I call a lot of them by name because I think it's important to call people by name. So in some ways, my book is a thank you note to the Academy. And the other thing you said was, what is it that that I would tell someone about the Academy? Well, I would tell them that the Academy purports to value transparency and shared governance, and they need to understand those kinds of things. I would also have to tell them that the Academy is quite slow sometimes. I was on the original University Diversity Council many, many years ago. And when it first started, we had professors and administrators and Columbus leaders on that council. And after the third meeting, all the Columbus leaders quit because they said that the Academy is too slow for them. So one does have to understand the inner workings of the Academy.
And you also point out that, especially for leaders of color, that we find that sometimes in dealing with that slowness, sometimes in dealing with expectations of transparency that aren't always delivered, that we really have to do things to make sure that we're maintaining our own peace of mind, whether that's through self-care or having supportive networks, and sometimes taking things just a little more lightly. And so I really liked your chapter called Cartoons That Saved My Administrative Life, because there you seem to be thinking about different visual images that help for you to think about the idiosyncrasies of leadership. So I wondered if you could share a little bit from that chapter, or tell us some of your favorite cartoons, maybe just about two or so of them.
Okay, yes, I really, I really did keep cartoons in my desk drawer for comic relief and for mental health, for therapy, for managing emotional exhaustion, because the cartoon said things that I couldn't actually say to people. I had one chair to tell me once that everyone in her department had a specific kind of crazy. That was so funny to me and everything. So yes, I didn't grow up watching cartoons, but I kept these cartoons, first of all, from the New Yorker. And one cartoon, well, I should say that as soon as I was elected chair of English, one of the former department chairs sent me a cartoon that I have always kept. And that particular cartoon had a picture of all of these men in a boat, 6 on one side and 1 on the other side. And what the chair wrote, Valerie, what to expect. Maury. It was from Maury Beja, who was a former chair. And the whole point of the cartoon was that you could see all the people who presumably were the faculty, and they were using megaphones and they were just hollering at the chair. And the chair was doing all the work. The chair saw a different landscape from what they could see because the chair was one end and they were at the other. And I saw all kinds of things with that cartoon. I used to give these leadership workshops where I would spend every bit of 20 minutes just talking about that one cartoon. I would ask them questions like, how do you know that everybody in this boat is a full professor? And the answer would be because they're all older white men. So just different things. And then there were cartoons. One of my favorites was this one man is on the telephone and he tells the other man, no, Thursday's out, James. How about never? Is never good enough for you? And there were times when I was so busy that I wanted to say that to the person standing in front of me, but I didn't. And I had another cartoon where these two white women were sitting on a couch, and there was a white male sitting far away from them. And what one white woman tells the other white woman that Larry is a white male, but he hasn't been able to do much with it. And I thought that was really funny too, because it got at who were their original inheritors of affirmative action. And then there were all of these animal cartoons where one species intervenes in the lives of these other species. And some of you who are on this Zoom call probably are familiar with the one where the dog is sitting at the computer and he says, when you are on the computer, no one knows you are a dog. And I use that to talk about the difference between visibility and hypervisibility. And one of my favorite ones was, there's one where all of these white men are around this conference table, and this furry animal is at the head of the table, and the animal says, I'm the only fur-bearing animal in this room, and I'm getting mighty suspicious. But in looking at all these cartoons, I asked myself one day, where are the cartoons that are specifically about Black women's leadership? And I was so glad to see some cartoons by Angelia B. Lee, and those cartoons were indeed about Black women's leadership. And if you could show some of those on the screen, maybe just two of them, and I could quickly say something about them. One is from her Dr. Matters, as in Black Lives Matters. And here you see this Black woman, and she's given this talk to this large audience, and it's an ambitious, complex talk on the role of women in politics during the Middle Ages and at the same time across the Middle East and West Africa. So she's doing all of this, and she has graphs and comparative data. And then in the Q&A, the first question, somebody raises their hand and asks her, can I feel your hair? And that cartoon has been funny to me because it really shows how the question about hair trivializes and detracts from any substantive engagement with the subject matter. And so that's so common. And then the last cartoon that I'll share, so we have time for Q&A. If you could show the next one. Yes, this is one called Harassment Hair in the Dr. Matters series. And here's this Black woman, and she's going through the TSA, and her hair is locked and everything. She has, security is wanting to check her because they want to make sure that the clips in her hair don't belong to a gun, and they're checking her hair as if she's hiding ninja knives and projectiles. So they think that there are hidden weapons of mass destruction in this Black woman's hair, and they take a long time with her because de-weaponizing the Black body is a lengthy task. And the reason I like this particular cartoon is because ever since 9/11, I know every time I go through TSA, they're always checking my hair. It's rather embarrassing. So I try to go through myself without having a white colleague with me, because they're going to check my hair and they're not going to check their long ponytails or anything. So it's a cartoon that pretty much asks, when was the last time anyone heard of African-American woman hiding explosives in her braids? I don't think we do that.
Well, that happens to you. That happens to me too. So I think, again, this is a reminder that even the ways that class and professionalism may allow for us certain privileges, race and gender, not only in the academy, but throughout our nation and different systems, continues that kind of check, especially on our bodies, of what they think professionalisms, what they think leaders, and what they think humanity really should look like. So I want to pause and invite some questions from our audience again, in knowing that you've been able to add so many kind of rich comments for us today, drawing both from your personal experience and in thinking about some of the kind of larger trends that you're seeing. So at this time, we're happy to have questions for Valerie. And as people are typing those, I want to ask you another maybe brief one, in saying that often when we're at events like this, someone will say, you know, I came to this event because I want to learn more about what I can do to inform or enhance diversity and inclusion at Ohio State. Where do you think leaders can start? Anyone who has any kinds of budgetary or simply influential, maybe without a title, where can they start?
Okay, well, that's a loaded question. And I do have a chapter in the book where I give at least 50 different things that departments and units can do. I didn't come up with that list by myself. I wrote it as a result of a retreat that I was on with other professionals. And so I won't go through that, but I have that there. And there are places in the book where I do answer that more directly. But here's what I want to say. My main thrust was to write about the poetry of diversity, what it feels like for people who are going through this and who are actually doing it. There are a lot of books that give you the prose of diversity, the PROSE, and they'll show you the charts and the statistics. But I was more interested in the prose of diversity, what it means to actually walk that journey. I do think the unit that you're in now, the diversity and inclusion, as one of the top, if not the top such unit in the nation, is a good place if people want to walk over there and learn about some of the things they could be doing.
Great. And along those same lines, I think someone asked if you could elaborate on the kind of anonymity and the hypervisibility that seems to frame not just your life, but often the life of faculty and staff and students of color on university and college campuses. So that anonymity and hypervisibility.
Yes, it's really odd because those are contrasting positions that we often find ourselves in. On one hand, you get ignored, marginalized, or sidelined. But then on the other hand, if you're not there at a meeting, you're supposed to be, everybody knows you're not there because you were the only Black person there. And so you go through those kinds of things. And I give a lot of examples in my book of instances like that. One quick example was I had a colleague to tell me that when I go on a sabbatical that I should put on my checks my full title, Dr. Valerie Lee, and write on it that Dr. Valerie Lee and attorney James Lee, and I would get all of this good service and everything at stores. That was a mistake because there are so few persons having all of those titles that every time I got to a store, I can't tell you how many people said, well, what are you supposed to be? Claire and Claire Hustable and Dr. Hustable, you know, are you the Cosby family? And many times they would call management because they thought we stole the checks, you know. That's you know, your hypervisibility, and I could tell other stories. I had some feminist scholars once who wanted me to participate in their research, and they assured me anonymity. And then I found out their research was they're doing something with the bodies of women, and they wanted the women to be the Venus that comes out of the seashell and everything, nude. And I said, well, are you crazy? I can't do that. In the whole consortium, there are only 2 other Black women, and they're much older than I am, and my students will know whose body that is, so we're always shuffling between visibility and hyper anonymity and hyper visibility.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask two questions from the audience, maybe put these together, because one of the questions I asked earlier was, what kind of characteristics do you think that people need to have to be leaders? And we talked briefly about humility, a willing to really support others, see their agendas thrive. But another one of those things, especially advice that's often given to women leaders, is you need an executive presence. And so one of the anonymous viewers here has said that they've seen you really kind of come in and command a room. Do you have any tips for other people in creating an executive presence? And along with that, someone else asked, is there any advice that you have for either younger leaders, or maybe that you would have told a younger version of yourself as you were starting that journey?
Good questions. Your younger version of myself. When I was young, I remember I was in a faculty meeting, and a faculty member said that we will hire more Blacks when we can find more qualified ones. And I was really young then, at the beginning of my career, and I walked out. I walked out. Later in life, when those kind of statements were made, like we want to find more qualified women or qualified persons of color. I mean, they never say we want to find more qualified men or more qualified whites. It's always women and people of color. I would stay in the room and actually confront it, not walk out in a heap of anger, but try to confront it, because I had more confidence later. So that's the difference between the younger Valerie and the later Valerie. The older Valerie realized that you have to be in certain positions in order to transform the academy. And if you keep walking out, if you're not in the room where it happens, as the play Hamilton says, and you can't do certain kinds of changes. So I want to decide the menu and the venue in order to change things.
I love that. I love that. And not just to have to bring your own chair or even your own folding chair to the table if there isn't room, but to change the table, the environment, the menu, the venue itself. So I want to thank you again for all of your comments that you've shared today, especially your inspiration in reminding us, as one of the audience members had a question about how to fight the good fight. But I think that not only today, but in so many of the pages and stories from the book, you end up sharing more about that. So thanks again. We'd like to conclude today's program by also I would personally like to thank my staff at the Women's Place, as well as our partners in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, as well as Gramercy Books. So thanks again. And I would like to as well bring to your attention that if you feel, as I do, that you simply want to congratulate Valerie or to give more feedback to the Women's Place about additional programming, please do take some time today to think about purchasing the book and viewing the survey for today with the code that's on the screen now. I will also share that we hope to see you again for what will be one of our new programs. This is our second year of fostering and providing the Symposium Forward, which this year will be on Friday, March 4th from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. with a special keynote who's to be revealed shortly. So stay tuned for registration information. And again, please do join us and give us feedback by either clicking the link that is in the chat to you or by following the QR code from your phone. Thanks again so much. We look forward to having you.